For hundreds of years, high birth rates have been used as a way of extending your empire and as a weapon of war.
Bloody hell.
Women having high numbers of children, families having so many spare, traditionally Catholic countries, but for Catholic countries this has been in decline recently, partly because of the high costs of living. But for Jewish communities and Jewish mothers, it's a religious need to have as many children as you can manage, not necessarily that you can afford. And cheap settlement housing in areas that aren't yours is a way that your offspring can, well, radicalise themselves and justify their aggressive actions towards the indigenous population. And then all those spares get backed up by militarisation. This is Israel and the West Bank is the perhaps...
Wait! I've got something to tell the whole family. Oh, quick, go and get the others in, Gordon. The mill's closed. There's no more work. We're destitute. Come in, my little loves. I've got no option but to sell you all for scientific experiments. No, that's the way it is, my loves.
Comparable to Jewish birth rates in the east coast of America.
Blame the Catholic Church for not letting me wear one of those little rubber things.
America as well. One of the last places on earth.
They've done some wonderful things in their time. They've preserved the might and majesty, even mystery of the Church of Rome.
And India and China have declining birth
The sanctity of the sacraments, the indivisible oneness of the Trinity.
rates. There is hope for the earth.
But if they let me wear one of those little rubber things on the end of my cock, we won't be in the mess we are now.
The spares will inherit the earth. France...
Couldn't Mummy have won some sort of pessary?
Not if we're going to remain members of the fastest growing religion in the world, my boy. You see, we believe... Well, let me put it like this. There are Jews in the world. There are Buddhists. There are Hindus and Mormons, and then...
France and the lingua franca, when much of the privileged world, if not the civilised world, spoke French. This was, for centuries, France had one of the highest populations in Europe for centuries. This is...
I'm a Roman Catholic and have been since before I was born.
Not allowing birth control, but they also, when I say they, it's not...
And the one thing they say about Catholics is they'll take you as soon as you're warm.
Particularly just the French. People were trafficked from other surrounding Catholic countries like Italy and Spain, through Venice, from all over really. The end consumer of these trafficked people, Amsterdam and Portugal, the Habsburgs, and of course Paris. The kings of
Catholic the moment that came because
France were able to pursue certain policies because of
every sperm is sacred.
Of all this disposable surplus population.
Every sperm is great.
Large landmass area of France, certainly compared to Britain.
If a sperm is wasted, God gets quite irate.
It was able to support rich agriculture.
Every sperm is sacred.
That was labour intensive.
Every sperm is great.
And nurture those labour intensive luxury goods, crafts, manufacture, in a fairly cottage style. Those warm antiques have layers and layers and polished and polished.
Let the heathen spill theirs on the dusty ground.
Et la foule vient me jeter entre ses bras.
God shall make them pay for each sperm that can't be found.
Emporté par la foule
Every sperm is wanted.
qui nous entraîne, écrasés l'un contre
Every sperm is good.
l'autre, nous ne formons qu'un seul corps.
Every sperm is needed.
Et le flot sans effort nous pousse enchaîner l'un
In your neighborhood.
et l'autre, et nous laisse tous deux épanouis
In du taoist moment,
enivrés et heureux,
Bill, there's just anywhere.
entraînés par la foule qui s'élance
But God loves those who treat them.
et qui danse une folle farandole, nos demain restent soudés.
If the sperm is wasted.
Et parfois soulevés, nos deux corps enlacés s'envolent.
Seamen with more care.
Et retombent tous deux épanouis, enivrés et heureux.
God gets quite irate.
Every sperm is sacred.
Every sperm is good. Every sperm is needed.
In your neighborhood.
Every sperm is useful. Every sperm is fine.
Time to some of the very first colonisation.
God needs everybody's mine
And mine.
and mine.
Colonisations of the Americas. There were penal colonies in New France, obviously, but there was lots of military. And those military, they need girlfriends, shall we call them, don't they? A privilege of the officers, perhaps only. In what's now the 13th arrondissement of Paris, there used to be a gunpowder factory, hence the name, acquired when Louis XIV established Petit Saint-Pétrière Hospital. Hôpital. It was a hospice for the poor of Paris. There was already a hospital of sorts in
God just strike them down for
1600s Paris. This main
a sperm that's built in vain.
hospice was for women who were learning disabled, mentally ill or epileptic, as well as poor. Of the pity that was for beggars, children and orphans joined. So this hospital produced sheets and military clothing. The children did. A women's prison was also added to the site with a total capacity of 300 for convicted prostitutes. It provided wretched living conditions for its inmates. 10,000 patients and 300 prisoners by the time of
So
the
you see
revolution.
my problem, little
Big.
ones? I
It
can't
had
keep
no
you all
real
here any longer.
medical function, this hospice. The sick were sent to the Hotel Dieu hospital. Now,
I can't keep you all
undoubtedly,
here any longer. God has blessed us so much. I can't afford to feed
a
you
number
anymore.
of the residents of the hospice would have been sent to New France, the Americas, to help
It's not as simple as that,
repopulate.
Nigel. God knows
It wasn't
all.
just Montreal,
He'd
it
see
was
through
also
such a cheap
Louisiana and the Caribbean as well. There were lots of
We do
interracial
to
relationships,
ourselves.
and
We do to him.
many of Louisiana society quite proudly trace their heritage back to these first Creole offspring.
Children, I know you're trying to
Some of
help,
the women
believe
sent
me.
to the Caribbean
My
were
mind's
actually
made up. I've given
sent
this
back
long
to
and
France
careful thought.
because they weren't appropriate in some way or other. Perhaps they were just
And it
too
has to be medical
disabled or mentally ill to work while they were popping out the population for the new colonies. France was concerned, you see, France was concerned, you see, because the British enclaves were having much higher population, immigration, reproduction than the French enclaves. And they were going to lose the whole continent of America for that reason. The French population started to spread loosely amongst the Indian community, Native American community as well, around the British enclave though, linking Montreal and Louisiana. But many of the trappers, fur traders, who didn't have such a good hunt, tended to sell themselves into slavery just for something to eat from the Native Americans. The 7 Years' War, the Treaty of Paris, and the eventual Louisiana Purchase would eventually put an end to any French claims in the Americas and the Gulf of Mexico. Beaver was becoming rare in Europe and plentiful in the Americas. St. Lawrence, the region. People rather wrongly describe the king's daughters, the Fields of Roy, as coming from the Petit Salpêtrière Hôpital. The king's daughters were something quite different, really. Women and girls were emigrating to New France anyway, before and after the king's daughters, but not enough of them. I guess some of King Louis XIV's officers were fighting amongst themselves, but even then they wouldn't have been that impressed with a disabled epileptic imbecile, would they? What was found to be one of the main problems overall was that Paris isn't a good place to take women for the soldiers and the fur traders and the priests. It's a very agricultural-based colony, and the women would be expected to work, but they know nothing about agriculture coming from Paris, do they? The Fields de Roy were also known as the King's Wards. The King's Wards were mainly between the ages of 12 and 25, and many had to supply a letter of reference from their parish priests before they could be chosen for immigration to New France, where no one wanted to go to. The King's daughters were transported to France. They received a dowry at the king's expense, and women who emigrated voluntarily using their own money. They were not necessarily of royal or noble parentage, but there was state patronage. Most of the women recruited were commoners of humble birth. As a Field de Roy, a woman received the king's support in several ways. The king paid 100 livres, that's the note of the day, to the French East India Company for each woman's crossing, as well as furnishing her trousseau, her hope box, what might be a wardrobe in a backpack today, and some basics for the kitchen. The crown also paid a dowry for each woman. This was originally set at 400 livres, but the treasury could not spare such an expense. The dowry was in part to attract the husband, the prettiest, getting married off at the first landing point on the New World. But the dowry did give them some security and independence. Some didn't want to get married when they got there. One ended up getting condemned as a prostitute. As well as Paris, some were from Normandy and the western regions. But to be supported by the king's dowry, the women were held to scrupulous standards, which were based on their moral calibre and whether they were physically fit enough to survive the hard work demanded by life as a colonist. The colonial officials sent several back because they were deemed below the standards set out by the king and the intendant. Le Hôpital Général de Paris and Saint-Sauveur.
Sous le ciel de Paris s'envole une chanson.
Hospice were a source for decades. Socially, the women were from very different backgrounds, but all were very poor. They might have been from an elite family that had lost its fortune, or from a large family with children to spare. Officials usually matched women of higher birth with officers or gentlemen living in the colony, sometimes in the hopes that the nobles would marry the young women and be encouraged to stay in Canada, Louisiana, Gulf of Mexico, rather than return to France. A few women came from other European countries, including Germany, England and Portugal. It's starting to sound like the French Foreign Legion of women repopulating and producing rather than shooting and killing. That's nice, isn't it? It might be a few years before the women found a husband. They might get engaged in a church in front of a priest and then sign a marriage document with the notary. The intentions were published 3 times, the banns of marriage, and if no one objected or had other better claims, then they were contracted. The marriage contracts represented a protection for the women, both in terms of financial security if anything were to happen to them, or their husband, and in terms of having the liberty to annul the promise of marriage if the man they had chosen proved incompatible. A substantial number of Filles du Roi who arrived in New France early on cancelled marriage contracts. Perhaps the dowry they had received made them disinclined to retain a fiancé with whom they found themselves dissatisfied. Perhaps some of the husbands were just after the dowry, or couldn't cope with the woman being in control. Some didn't even get on the boat in France. Some died on the arduous journey, and some undertook a second arduous journey to get back to France. And some just remained single. On arriving in Montreal, a big farmhouse was eventually acquired for housing all the Filles du Roi in. Can you just imagine all these guys chomping at the bit, with no decorum pestering the local area? Most of the girls were pregnant within a year. Myself, I don't understand how having children increases self-sufficiency of a colony, but perhaps it improves motivation. But more and more lucky girls from rural France were getting the opportunity to be Filles du Roi, King's Daughters. The penal expunging of criminal records of those of questionable morality sent to New France had limited success. But seeing the King's Daughters as prostitutes was salacious and fun for contemporary writers. In the conservatism of the time, the Filles du Roi as being of middling virtue, and they had emigrated in the hopes of religious absolution. This was the stuff of Lady Chatterley's lover of the time, or Shades of Grey, or some other such contemporary circus act. But that one King's Daughter, a prostitute, she ended up having lots of children out of wedlock, so she was a success. Montreal got the leftovers, Trois-Rivières, and then Quebec City got the choice picks. Now, don't get me wrong, this is the King's Daughters we're talking about here. The spares of the wealthy, or the children of the ruined. There were, of course, obviously, the casket girls and the correction girls. The casket girls were conspicuous by reason of their virtue. They were recruited from church charitable institutions, usually orphanages and convents, and although poor, were guaranteed to be virgins. It later became a matter of pride in Alabama, Mississippi, New Orleans. Girls from the Pelican, a boat from France, arrived, even though their party had brought yellow fever and decimated much of the population after a stop-off in Cuba. The 14 to 19-year-olds were married off within a month to a man of their choosing. Though I'm reading young women were married to men of their choosing, which sounds plural to me. I'll repeat. the women had certain powers, there was such thing as the Petticoat Rebellion. If your new husband's off in the woods trying to trap in beaver all day long, and they weren't building log cabins, nice roof over the head for their new wife, and they weren't really bringing in very good food. This was in the days of keep 'em barefoot and pregnant. But the husbands were refused bed and board. No comforts, you get no comfort. Proved quite effective for the most part. There are contemporary engravings from the 1600s depicting the departure of comfort girls to the New World. But this wasn't a new idea. The Portuguese had been sending out orphans of the king to their empires, mainly west, not many to Goa and the Asian countries at all. Slightly differently, though, the orphans of the Queen were to be married to local young men of Portuguese descent and descendants with the natives, and the natives as a making friends. We've had some of your girls, you can have some of our girls, who were both noble and non-noble girls. The native rulers seemed quite pleased. By the time that they were 12 to 30, they were ready for the shelter of the castle. They'd been selected and educated to a certain extent. They'd had an upbringing and what was needed by the time they were sent to Portuguese India or the colony of Brazil. Portugal being Habsburgs, the Queen of Catarina de Austria was also sending boatloads of girls with their dowries. Catholic orphanages of Lisbon were packed to the rafters, so they sent them to India. There was too many Portuguese marrying indigenous people, but there were objections in Portugal because there wasn't enough husbands in the colonies. Sending the girls was little more than sending baubles to the natives. Dutch privateers, pirates, basically seized a couple of these orphan girl ships and took them as their brides. But Dutch pirates also sold them to local merchants. After converting them to Protestantism rather than Catholic, they were married to very wealthy merchants. But back to Petit Saint-Pétrier Hôpital.
Me dit que nos vies ne valent pas grand-chose, elles passent un même instant comme fanent les roses.
Napoleon certainly wasn't the first to raid orphanages for his army, but so many wars have had their effect on France's population. And there are now fairly empty rural swathes through the hexagon. But as may be fairly obvious to you, that just meant huge numbers of these spares lived in abject poverty, and a bad harvest could lead to significant numbers starving. At the very least, poor nutrition and sickness. We're looking back in time to some
Me dit que nos vies ne valent pas grand-chose, elles passent un même instant comme fanent les roses. Me dit que le temps qui glisse est un salaud, que de
10,000 patients and 300 prisoners at the time of the revolution. The September massacres, 1793, the Salpêtrière was stormed. 3rd, 4th September by a mob from the impoverished working class district of the Faubourg Saint-Marcel, not so impoverished these days, with the avowed intention of releasing the detained prisoners. 134 prostitutes were released. 25 mad women were less fortunate and were dragged, some still in their chains, into the streets and murdered. Personifications of dementia, megalomania, acute mania, melancholia, idiocy, hallucination, erotomania and paralysis could be seen in the gardens of the Salpêtrière. Erotomania isn't necessarily what you think it is. It's more of a delusional disorder, like stalker-like behaviours. They may believe one or several people are their secret admirers. They might never even have met these people, but through subtle methods such as body posture or arrangement of household objects, and they get sent messages through strange things, innocuous stuff and coincidences. Mood swings, poor judgment, confusion, hallucinations, early onset Alzheimer's, dementia, alcohol and some substances abuses, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. They're all related. It's like a narcissism. There was a lot of loss in those days. It can be a way of to cope with severe loneliness or ego deficit following a major loss. It can be unsatiated urges dealing with homosexuality or narcissism. But Salpêtrière Hôpital became to be known as a centre for investigating mental illnesses, and electrocuting people came about from doctors hanging out there, not necessarily appointed there. It's now a general teaching hospital, and numerous personalities that you all know have been treated there. Michael Schumacher, Ronaldo, Prince Rainier of Monaco, Gerard Depardieu, Jacques Chirac, Josephine Baker, the dancer, in 1975 had a cerebral hemorrhage. And Princess Diana of Wales, after her car crash, joined the salubrious list of Salpêtrière women. Bicêtre Hospital, in the southern suburbs of Paris, became known as much more terrible than the Bastille. It was a lunatic asylum, a prison, an orphanage, just the same. But its most notorious guest was the Marquis de Sade.
Quelqu'un qui m'a dit que tu m'aimes encore, serait-ce possible alors? Serait-ce possible alors? Quelqu'un m'a dit que tu m'aimes encore. Quelqu'un qui m'a dit que tu m'aimes encore, serait-ce possible alors?
Napoleon certainly wasn't the first to raid orphanages for his army, but so many wars have had their effect on France's population. And there are now fairly empty rural swathes through the hexagon. But as may be fairly obvious to you, that just meant huge numbers of these spares lived in abject poverty, and a bad harvest could lead to significant numbers starving. At the very least, poor nutrition and sickness. We're looking back in time to some